Tom, you had mentioned Lars, and the story of Megadeth runs parallel to Metallica, which we'll see. Now, I was not on our Metallica album. I think, Rob, you may have hosted that with a guest named Nick.
Yeah,
And so, Rob, I'm going to have you keep me honest here as I run this
sure.
parallel track. If I say anything off about Metallica, I'm going to have you chime in if
Well,
you remember anything.
hold on, Adam. I'm not certainly not a Metallica expert, first of all. And
Right.
two, to be clear, we covered the Black Album, which was kind of later,
It came out the same time
somewhat
as,
phase
yeah,
two of Metallica, let's say, at the
yeah,
very
sure.
least. And they have a couple albums on the list. So I think we purposely didn't go too deep into the backstory. Instead, talked about their rise into the pop world. So just saying that. But yes, I think this is a familiar story, and I'm happy to jump in.
Cool. All right, so right off the bat, I was floored with the amount of drugs that were involved in the Megadeth story. I know we've covered Black Sabbath, the Rolling Stones, Metallica, Guns N' Roses, but these dudes may actually take the cake on just the sheer insanity of their drug use. So we can look forward to that in the story. But today we're going to really focus on the main creative force in the band, a guy named Dave Mustaine. And in prep for this week, I read a book by Dave Mustaine called Rust in Peace, the inside story of the Megadeth masterpiece. He called his own
Wow.
stuff a masterpiece. Now, there
Wow.
are contributions from some of the other musicians in the book, but let's be honest, Dave is pretty cocky and he's a lunatic as well. Now, so take all of these stories from him with a grain of salt, maybe.
I think at some point, didn't Alice Cooper have to pull him aside and go, "You're doing a little too
Yes.
much, man. You need to
Yeah.
chill out here."
Well,
Now, I
but
knew
he also followed that very familiar path of now he is a born again Christian who's actually pretty right wing and
yeah.
used that as his drug rehab program. And good for him for getting clean. You know, I don't wish a life of addiction on anybody, but you don't then have to also become a dick about it
Well, that's the
after you
thing.
get clean.
You're
Yeah.
like, how can I be sober but still be an asshole?
Yeah.
He perfected it from all the interviews I've seen. So he's a prickly pear, which I guess is kind of understandable considering his life, which we'll get into now. So Dave Mustaine was born in 1961 in a suburb of San Diego to parents Emily and John. Now, his father, John, was a branch manager at a Bank of America who lost his job due to automation in the early 60s. And he started drinking and drinking hard. So his father was a very abusive drunk. Dave was the youngest of four kids and the only son, and his sisters would later relate some of the really abusive stories of how their father treated them and his mother. So in 1965, Emily, the mother, and John get divorced. John basically then stalks his family as Emily moves herself and kids around California trying to avoid him. So right off the bat, Dave doesn't really have a stable setting in which to grow up. He's not making friends. And on top of that, their mother, who is basically also a functional alcoholic, converted from being a Lutheran to a Jehovah's Witness when Dave was 7. That means, if you're not familiar with Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't believe in celebrations. So no more birthdays, no more Christmas. Pretty rough childhood to have all that taken away from you.
Adam, is your goal here to turn Dave Mustaine into a sympathetic character? Is that what you're trying to do here? You have a pretty hard road to hoe here, but I will hear
I'm
you
going to
out.
do my
I will hear you
damnedest
out.
to tell you the Marvel style backstory to this supervillain. And in addition to feeling alienated from everybody, Dave and the family is very poor. They wound up living with one of Dave's older sisters who married a cop. And this is how Dave really started to get into music. So this cop owned an extensive collection of 60s crooners. And so this is where Dave credits his love of melody was listening to all these 60s crooners. I think it really only ever came out in his guitar.
Did he
And so
have like an old record player that was set to 78 and he was putting the 33 and a thirds on it, and that's where he got the idea?
this Sinatra kicks ass.
Yeah.
So his mother, so his mother buys him his first acoustic guitar as a graduation present when he graduated, I think, from middle school. And he said in interviews later on in life that he said later on in interviews in his life that he learned to play because his sister sucked at the piano so hard. So, like, why would you say that? You couldn't just say I learned guitar because I wanted to play it. It was to show up your sister. And you're
Asshole's gonna asshole, man.
oh my
Comes through in everything you do.
So by 13, he started jamming, smoking pot with kids in the neighborhoods. And this is also the point where he discovers Kiss and he becomes obsessed with their stage presence and lead guitarist Ace Frehley. And now he knows that this is the lifestyle that he wants. He wants the fame, he wants the stardom. And at that same time, he brings home a Judas Priest album. And that cop that they were living with beats the shit out of him because Judas Priest is devil music. So at
not because Judas Priest is gay. That's not why.
Maybe a little of both, actually.
Yeah. I don't think anybody knew at the time.
No, I don't think that was out there at the time.
No, definitely not. So Dave moves out at 15 and gets an apartment and starts selling pot to make money. I don't know how that happens. Again, he kind of brushed over those details. So he starts.
Here's how that happens, by the way, that even your parents, or even your mom is like, you know what? You're such an asshole. You want to move out? Yeah, that works for me. I don't have to deal with you every day. Yeah, go ahead. How about you just go ahead and get your own place? There we go.
In 1978, Dave is around 17 years old and he drops out of high school and buys an electric guitar and joins a band called Panic. And Panic was definitely leaning towards hard rock, that metal sound. Now, tragically, that band ended pretty quickly when their drummer and sound man were killed in a car accident.
Oh.
And not to write off that tragedy, but Dave needs to get moving. He's got to keep moving in his music career. So Panic falls apart and he starts looking in newspapers for gigs. And he stumbles across one that catches his eye. The ad said, guitarist wanted, someone influenced by Maiden and Motorhead and Budgie. Budgie was a Welsh metal band from the 70s. And this was all for a little band calling themselves Metallica. So Dave calls the number in the ad, and according to Lars Ulrich, the drummer for Metallica, Dave Mustaine is either coked up or on speed because they're on the phone, and Dave basically talks at Lars for like 10 minutes straight. Now, whatever he said worked because they asked him to come in for an audition. Now, as the story goes, Dave rolls into the rehearsal space. He plugs in and starts warming up. James Hetfield, who's the guitarist and singer, and Lars is the drummer for Metallica. Both James and Lars leave the rehearsal room. So Dave continues to warm up and he's running scales and drills and he keeps turning the amp up because he's alone. So the thing's up at like 10, 30 minutes goes by and he's just in there playing and he eventually thinks, what the hell's going on? So he puts his guitar down, walks into an adjoining room where the guys are in there getting high and drinking. And he says, like, are we going to do this thing? Am I going to audition? And Lars looks up at him and says, no, you got the job. So without actually playing with him, something about his chops, his speed, his style was enough to earn him a spot in Metallica.
I mean, it is the early days of this kind of music, right? So I imagine there weren't too many players who could
shredding
be
this.
Yeah, exactly. Be this freaking ferocious.
Yeah. Now,
and to be fair, Metallica, James Hetfield is not a virtuoso guitar player. James Hetfield is not nearly as good as Dave Mustaine at the guitar.
Sure.
Kirk Hammett is a good guitar player, but I wouldn't say that he is as good as Dave Mustaine is either. Like Kirk Hammett's got an interesting style, but Dave Mustaine is a shredder. And Lars Ulrich is not a very good drummer. Listening to this album, by the way, the contrast, I was like, oh, okay. Yeah.
This is the
Lars
drummer.
is actually just kind of doing a lot of like boom cha.
Yeah, that's the open secret. No one in Metallica is actually that great at their instrument.
Except for Cliff Burton. Cliff Burton was great back.
Cliff Burton was really good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me just comment, being the guitar player in the room, or well, Adam's a guitar player as well. But I think Kirk Hammett is quite fast and good, but he's much more pentatonic. So he's kind of more blues based, and whereas this style is much more neoclassical.
You just had to get that in there, Rob.
Yeah, I did.
Neoclassical. Yeah.
I like it. It cracks me up. I think there's still a lot of animosity that exists in the fan community because the story that I just told about the rehearsal, or rather what's it called? The audition. Was corroborated by Lars, James Hetfield, and Dave Mustaine. But in the Wikipedia history of Metallica, it said that they hired Mustaine because of his expensive guitar equipment. So whoever's editing the wiki page for Metallica is definitely on Team Metallica, not on Team Mustaine. So in the fall of 1981, Dave joins Metallica, and almost immediately the sparks start to fly when Dave gets in a fight with the rest of the band about what sneakers they should wear on stage. And that's because Dave already thinks that he's somehow the creative force in the band that he was just hired into. Are you surprised?
Way to pick your battle.
Right.
Sneakers you're gonna wear.
I will die on this hill. I'll die on the sneaker hill.
I mean, and you look at the early days of this kind of fashion, you were basically looking like a hobo. You were functionally homeless looking. Nobody was a fashion maven. It was ripped up, shitty old clothes. So did he have a preference on what kind of stains your sneakers should have on them or something? What the hell?
That's a blood stain. That looks like a vomit stain. We should all line
Got to
up.
coordinate the stains.
So Metallica plays their first gig in March of 82 to about 200 people. And immediately they are considered at the forefront of this new thing that's developing called thrash metal, which has been described as punk meets metal. So think angst, testosterone, anarchy, and super, super fast tempo. So 2 months later, they score some gigs, I think maybe opening for some other bands at Whiskey A Go-Go, and they're getting some record label interest. Now, early on, Dave is showing his true self. He does this throughout his career. He does this Jekyll and Hyde thing where when he gets drunk, you're not sure who's going to show up. Most of the time, it was the monster that showed up. Now, at this point, Metallica's bassist is a guy named Ron McGovney. And Dave used to just pick fights and get into fist fights with the other members of the band. And early on was just establishing himself as an asshole. And the biggest asshole story I could find was that Ron McGovney, the original Metallica bass player, recalls a story where, for literally no reason, Dave Mustaine walks up during a rehearsal and just pours a beer into McGovney's bass, like into the pickups, all over it. There's beer coming out of the input jack. So they fire him. No, not Mustaine, McGovney, because he's not quote unquote dangerous enough. And they said he didn't contribute anything.
He should have knifed him or something like that.
Right.
Then he would
I
have
don't
stayed
get
in the
it.
band.
But to your point, they then hire Cliff Burton. Okay, so Dave's making himself known as a bad boy, a loose cannon, and quite frankly, a pretty scary guy in terms of his violent outbursts and depending on the drug that he happens to be taking at the time. So their stage performances in LA at this point are really making them legends before they even release any music. So Metallica's riding this underground wave of heavy British metal bands that were popular in the 80s and a super loyal but small fan base. And in 83, Metallica releases a demo tape. And while Dave is already starting to fray a bit from drugs and alcohol, this was the closest thing to a family that he'd really ever had. Rob, I think in prior episodes, you talked about just what it's like being in a band. You know, you're kind of a band of brothers. You're living
Absolutely.
in a band with guys for years, and you're constantly experiencing life at a young age together. And especially experiencing all the insanity that comes along with being in a metal band.
Oh, I mean,
Yeah.
we were not even that popular in the chop, but those were some of the headiest days of my life. Just that concept of like rolling into a city and playing a show. You felt like you were like this band of pirates coming in to ravage a city with your rock and then dip out before the sun came up type of thing.
I think there's just a really strong sense of us versus the world. You're either in the circle or you're not, you know, because you are also starting a business. You are also having fun. You're also having these wild times, but it's just us versus every other person, and no one else can break into the circle.
So in May of 1983, Metallica packs up and drives across the country in a U-Haul, and they're headed for Rochester, New York, where they're going to record an album. Now, unbeknownst to Dave Mustaine, who would sleep in the back of the truck, James and Lars were listening to demo tapes of other guitarists on the ride to New York. So it's a bad sign for Dave.
They're all assholes. All of them are assholes. As to quote the dude, bunch of assholes.
So they played 2 gigs in New York while they're also recording this demo. And around this time, Dave gets wind that the guys are working on a record contract with a guy named Johnny Zazula from Megaforce Records. And he notices that all the paperwork has all the other band members' names on it except his. Now, Lars assures Dave that it's just a paperwork issue. But then on April 11th, 1983, Dave wakes up to Lars telling him to pack up his shit and leave and that he's out of the band. 40 minutes later, James Hetfield drops Dave off at a bus station with his guitar. James Hetfield is crying because he feels terrible about it. These guys were basically inseparable for 2 years, and this is the start of our Marvel style origin story for Dave Mustaine and Megadeth.
Did you get more? So I know there's a lot of contention around Dave Mustaine being fired. Some say it was because he had a worse drug problem, an alcohol problem than the rest of the band, even though they were all clearly nuts. Some say it was because it was Dave and Lars button heads and there can only be one leader in a band. Did you get any more detail on that or corroboration?
From Mustaine's standpoint, it was he recalled it as, looking back in retrospect, was that it was his drug and alcohol problem and his fiery temper and all the fights. But to your point, Lars is the leader, and here's this guy who jumps in and says, no, guess what? I'm actually the leader of the band. Like, who the hell are you? So I think it's probably a mix. Maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle there.
Dave Mustaine's like, I'm the guy who's actually really good at this instrument. Right. So maybe that's why I should be the leader of this band.
All right. So now Dave gets fired and he's got a 4-day bus ride back to Los Angeles, and he is crushed by the band's decision. But the sadness quickly turns to anger. He is steaming. His rage is festering. He's the angriest he's ever been in his life. And it's on this bus ride that he not only commits himself to forming a revenge band, but also comes up with the name Megadeth.
First of all, I love that it's a revenge band. Let me just say that. Yeah, Dave Mustaine, hat tip to you. Revenge bands are great. And the fact that you've maintained this anger for this many decades is really impressive.
It's quite impressive. He comes up with the name Megadeth on the bus ride because it was on a pamphlet for some politician that he found on the bus. Megadeth was referring to when 1 million people die from a nuclear blast. I'm assuming that concept spoke to Dave while he was festering on the bus for 4 days. So Dave said the mission statement of his yet to be formed band was to be the fastest, the heaviest, the most furious metal band ever. And he also wanted to be the most dangerous band on the planet. Now, since Dave is on a 4-day bus trip, Lars from Metallica starts calling people in LA to get ahead of the story and do some damage control. And he gives his version of the events. That story is Dave is a lunatic, he's violent, he's dangerous, and he's an unpredictable alcoholic. Which is all basically true, but you shouldn't say it.
Good on Lars, though. That shows some savvy Machiavellian leadership, though, right there.
Yeah, right.
Listen, maybe we're going to talk more about it, but I just want to get into the fact that this is one of the most compelling stories in rock and roll, because when else has this thing happened where someone gets kicked out of a prominent band, there's an acrimonious breakup or firing, and then they also go on to be a huge band of themselves in the same genre.
Yeah, to like quote the internet meme, I'm going to make my own band with cocaine and hookers, and then he does it, and it kills it.
So in that sense, bravo, certainly.
All right, so Dave finally gets back to LA, and he moves back in with his mother and starts hatching his plan, all the while being extremely depressed and drunk. Now, I want to introduce another key player in the story, and probably the longest serving member of Megadeth other than Dave Mustaine, and that's a guy named David Ellefson. So another Dave, but this one is 3 years younger than Mustaine, and in fact, they used to call him Junior in the band. But for us to keep this all straight today, I'm going to refer to David Ellefson by his last name, Ellefson. So Ellefson was born in 1961. He grew up in Minnesota and decided to move to LA in 1983 when he was 22 to attend the Musicians Institute, which is a music college in Los Angeles. So Ellefson was living in his student-assigned apartment in Hollywood when he met Mustaine. And as the story goes, Dave Mustaine woke up super pissed because the person in the apartment below him was practicing Running with the Devil on the bass. which, if you're not familiar, is not exactly the most complicated bass line. But if your amp is turned up to 10, it could drive you nuts. Boom, boom, boom. So Mustaine wakes up. I assume this is at 2:00 in the morning. I assume this is at 2:00 in the afternoon. And trying to get Ellefson's attention, he throws a potted plant at Ellefson's air conditioner, and Ellefson comes upstairs, introduces himself. They start talking music, and they realize they both have an affinity for the same type of music. And this is where Megadeth really starts to take shape.
Is this Mustaine's version of the story that he damages this man's air conditioner and the guy just comes up and is like, hey, what's up, dude? How's it going? Do you like music too?
Also corroborated by Ellefson.
Okay.
Ellefson came up, and I think Ellefson was actually with a friend, and they came up, and I don't know if they were intimidated by Mustaine, but they said, like, can you go buy us cigarettes? And Mustaine was like, no, but I'll go buy a beer. And so then they all got drunk.
Okay. So maybe they're just like real chill dudes. It's like,
yeah,
hey,
right.
man.
Right. It sounds like underage kids needed someone with an ID to get them drunk to make.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Oh, wait, Ellefson's 22. So maybe I'm mixing up stories here. All right.
I might also just be very poor.
Right.
A very big, a struggling musician living in LA. Yeah, that sounds about right.
So Dave Mustaine takes Ellefson under his wing, i.e., he took some innocent kid from Minnesota and got him turned into a crack addict at the end of the day, and also turned him on to heavy music. So the two began auditioning singers, but they stopped quickly, saying that no one matched Dave's intensity, and decided that he should be the singer.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah,
seriously. That's where it all went down.
No one has the resting bitch face of Dave Mustaine, that's for sure.
No one sounds like Tommy Pickles from Rugrats grew up and became the lead singer of a fucking metal band.
All right, so to round out the lineup, they got a guy named Gar Samuelson, who was a jazz fusion drummer, and one of his guitarist friends, a guy named Chris Poland. And oddly enough, these are the two guys who introduced Dave and Ellefson to heroin. It's always the jazz guys. So right from the start, these two dudes were complete junkies, and they were the ones who got Dave and Ellefson into snorting heroin. All right, so now we've got all of our key constituents for a great band: killer musicians, booze, heroin, and a lust for vengeance. And in the super tight, close-knit metal subculture of LA, word had already started spreading about a band that was too maniacal for Metallica.
Whoa. Well, can we just take a pause here? They're heroin addicts, and they're playing this fast. Can you imagine what it was like if they were speed freaks?
Well, they would balance out. So they would take so much cocaine that it would take them over the top, and then they would use the heroin to mellow themselves down to play at 180 beats per minute.
Speedballs, basically.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Yes, thank you. Now, to throw even more fuel on this revenge fire, in July of 1983, Metallica releases Kill 'Em All. And 4 songs that Dave had written were on the album, and he loses his goddamn mind. So Ellefson recalls that at the same time they were working on writing songs and music, and after Kill 'Em All comes out, Mustaine goes to rehearsal and takes everything up by like 30 beats a minute. He rewrites the lyrics so they're even angrier. And in 1984, Megadeth cuts a demo that's just under 12 minutes long and includes a song called Mechanics that's basically the same song as Four Horsemen on Kill 'Em All, but it's all about revenge, essentially. And I think it's about killing people with your car. I assume, again, all the people being killed are probably in Metallica.
Listen,
anyway.
I'm not necessarily on Team Mustaine here, but I'm with him on this one. If you left the band and had written a bunch of songs and they unceremoniously tossed you on a Greyhound back to LA with no notice when you're probably like hungover and going through withdrawals, and you were like, oh, don't play my fucking songs, and like, yeah, sure, whatever, dickhead. And they put 4 of your songs on their album, and then not only do they put them on your album, they then make it huge. I would be so pissed off. I'm surprised it wasn't I'm surprised he didn't kill them, to be honest.
Well, they do credit him, right?
Yeah, so he does wind up receiving royalties. So legally, they had to credit him for these.
Sure, but he wants to be famous.
Yeah, exactly. He doesn't just want writing credits on something or a check in the mail. He wants to be the most dangerous band in the world.
I get it. It would be a powerful spite tonic, but yeah, the royalty checks would soften the blow a little bit, right?
Oh, but you blow them pretty quick when you're doing speedballs. They're not cheap.
All right, so Megadeth cuts this bootleg demo, and the tapes start going crazy. People are copying them, sending them all over the place, and eventually, one of the bootlegs winds up on the desk of a guy named Barry Coburn, who was a record exec, with Combat Records. Combat Records famously signed Joni Mitchell and Carly Simon, and there will be a yacht rock thread at some point coming down the line. But anyway, so this guy, Barry Coburn, sees Metallica's early success and rushes to sign Megadeth and get them into the studio. And now, despite being a raging alcoholic and heroin addicts, they managed to write and record and release their 1985 debut called Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good. For an independent label, it did pretty well, selling 100,000 copies with Combat Records.
Don't leave out the ellipse in the middle there.
I'm sorry,
Killing Is My Business, ellipse, and business is good.
And business is good.
Pregnant pauses are very important to this band.
Now, in 1986, Combat Records sells Megadeth to Capitol Records. So now they got some real horsepower behind them. That they record and release their second album in late 1986, but the entire band is in really bad shape, completely strung out, constantly high on heroin. And Rob, this is when they were touring with Alice Cooper. And Alice Cooper pulls a 25-year-old Dave Mustaine inside and says, "Look, man, I've been where you are. I've done all the stuff you've done. You're going way too hard. You're going to die if you keep this up." And Dave, who was likely high at the time, promptly ignored him. And at this point, they are having fistfights nightly, destroying hotel rooms, struggling to get enough heroin in time for the shows. And the same week, Dave comes up to Ellefson and tells him that he's got bugs crawling under his skin. So things are falling apart. The wheels are coming off. Gar, the drummer, is asking for more money from Dave to feed his heroin addiction. Dave says no, so Gar starts selling his drums. And Chris, the guitar player, is stealing Dave Mustaine's guitars and selling them for heroin. So things are going great.
Stealing his guitars. That's the thing he's gonna notice as a professional guitar player. It always baffles my mind. Like, what's the dismount strategy here?
Right.
When Dave Mustaine comes back into the practice room and all of his guitars are gone, and the guy's just sitting there with a big bag of heroin. He's like, I have no idea how these things happen. I don't know.
I guess I just lost my guitars in the last 30 minutes.
Yeah.
So now Ellefson and Dave Mustaine start smoking crack as well. And so this keeps going on, but eventually we flash forward to 1988 when Megadeth is on the Monsters of Rock tour in Europe, and Ellefson is in such bad shape that he has to cancel the rest of the dates on that tour for them so he can come back to the US and get clean. So Dave and Ellefson, I think this is the first time they both go into rehab to try to get clean, but they both are constantly relapsing. And in one of the craziest rock stories I could find about these guys, in 1989, Dave Mustaine is arrested for reckless driving. He ran into a parked car, which happened to have an off-duty cop inside of it. And that's a good transition point for our favorite segment, By the Numbers. All right, the number 9. That's the number of drugs that were in Dave Mustaine's blood when he was arrested for reckless driving that I just mentioned. He had 15 types of drugs on him.
Can we guess the drugs? You got to start getting into exotics at that point, because I can name about 6, and then after
it was
that,
in my recipe at the top.
Yeah,
China White, all these weird ones. Yeah, 50 million. That's the estimated albums that Megadeth has sold worldwide since their start. 500. That's the dollars per day that Dave Mustaine was spending on heroin in 1989.
Man.
1. That's the number of times that Dave Mustaine actually died from ODing. Spoiler alert,
1
resuscitated him after he took a handful of Valium in 1993. Now, he didn't say how long he was dead for, but according to him, he was dead long enough that the hospital called his wife to tell her that he died. But then Dave Mustaine, come on, like, are we just supposed to think that you just sat up like the Undertaker in a WWF match? Like, how did they call your wife without actually being declared dead? I don't know.
Yeah, it's pretty metal if he did that.
Yeah, it's very metal, right?
Also, not metal enough, because didn't Slash have to get the Narcan shot like 5 times on one tour or something?
In his
like
heart, right?
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus. All right, 5,000, as in $5,000. That's the royalties that Dave Mustaine was getting once every 6 months from his contributions to that first Metallica album. 17, the number of times Dave had been through rehab by the time he was in his mid-40s. Didn't start sticking until the 15th time, but then he fell off the wagon a couple more. 16, the number of studio albums that Megadeth has released. That's insane. I can't imagine. Sorry, just listening to how, Rob, you mentioned how exhausting it was to listen to this. Can you imagine get through 16 albums like this?
Yeah, don't let Discography Dave give you a call about Megadeth.
Yeah, seriously. Well, didn't they also win a Grammy like in the last 10 years or something?
Yeah. Yep. I forget what it was for, but yeah, they definitely
and
won.
0, the number of Grammys that was deserved.
Right. Fastest album of the year.
All right. And $8,000 was the dollars given to Megadeth to record their first album. The band immediately spent half of that on heroin and cocaine, and then quickly went back to the record label and asked for another $4,000 to finish the album.
Yeah, story checks out.